I found a job on the dark web to watch people sleep. One of them woke up and asked for me by name. It started as a stupid way to make some quick cash. I never thought it'd turn into something more sinister, something that would haunt me. Like most people, I'd heard about the dark web, the stories, the warnings. You always hear that it's a place where you can buy anything, from drugs to stolen identities to, well, worse. But what most people don't realize is that it's also a place for jobs. Strange, unsettling jobs. I was desperate. Rent was due, and my regular 9 to 5 wasn't cutting it anymore. That's when I stumbled across a forum while aimlessly browsing the darker corners of the internet. It was simple at first, just a thread titled, "Easy Money for Watching People Sleep." I know how that sounds. Creepy, right? But at the time, it seemed harmless. I mean, it was just surveillance. A lot of companies do that, right? Maybe it was for security purposes, or maybe someone with a lot of money just wanted to feel safe at night. I clicked on the thread and read through the post. The instructions were vague. It said you'd be given access to live camera feeds of people's bedrooms. All you had to do was watch the streams for a few hours, report anything unusual, and get paid. The pay? $500 for one night. $500 to sit and watch someone sleep. I'd spent more time scrolling through Netflix trying to find something to watch. So, I did what any desperate, broke 20-something would do. I followed the link. It led me to a bare bones page. There was no fancy design, just a black background and a simple form asking for my contact information. I hesitated for a second, but eventually I filled it out. What was the worst that could happen? I figured I'd either get paid or I wouldn't hear back at all. 2 days later, I received an email. The subject line was just one word: hired. The message was short, direct, and a little eerie. Thank you for applying. Your shift begins tonight at midnight. Follow the instructions carefully. There was a link at the bottom and a password to enter once I clicked it. Midnight was only a few hours away, but the promise of $500 made it hard to say no. I had no idea what I was getting myself into. That night, I waited until the clock hit 11:55 p.m. I clicked the link in the email, entered the password, and was taken to a page with multiple camera feeds. Each one showed a different bedroom, dimly lit with a single figure lying motionless under the covers. There were no names, just numbers: 01, 02, 03, and so on. The instructions were simple: watch, take notes if anything unusual happened, report at the end of the shift. I scanned the feeds, expecting to feel uneasy, but it was surprisingly boring. People slept. Some snored softly, others didn't move at all. I jotted down a few notes out of obligation, but nothing seemed out of the ordinary. Hours passed, and I fought the urge to doze off. It was around 3:30 a.m. when something caught my eye on one of the feeds. Camera 07. The person lying in the bed, a man who had been still the entire night, suddenly shifted. It wasn't much, just a slight twitch, but enough to get my attention. I leaned in, watching the screen carefully. His eyes were closed, his breathing steady, but then, almost imperceptibly, his lips began to move. It was like he was muttering something in his sleep. I turned up the volume, but there was no sound. I strained my ears, trying to make out what he was saying, but it was too quiet. He kept mumbling, his lips moving faster now, like he was trying to say something important. I noted it down, thinking it was probably just a sleep-talking episode. I'd seen videos of that before. People mumble all sorts of nonsense in their sleep. But then, without warning, his eyes snapped open. I froze, staring at the screen. His eyes were wide, unblinking, and fixed directly on the camera. My heart skipped a beat. He wasn't looking around the room like someone who had just woken up from a dream. No, he was looking at me, through the camera, like he knew I was watching. My pulse quickened, and I instinctively reached for the volume knob, turning it all the way up. I expected to hear something now, anything. But the room remained silent, eerily so. And then, with a voice that was barely above a whisper, he spoke. "Are you there?" I recoiled, eyes glued to the screen. It felt like he was speaking to me directly. My logical brain kicked in. This had to be a coincidence. Maybe he was still dreaming, talking to someone else. But before I could calm myself down, he spoke again. "I know you're watching. My name." I jolted in my seat, nearly knocking over the cup of coffee I had beside me. He said my name. My actual name. There was no way he could know that. The feeds were anonymous, just numbers. There was no identifying information, no way to link me to the person on the other side of the screen. I sat there, staring at the monitor, trying to figure out what the hell was going on. The man didn't move. He just lay there, staring at me with those cold, unblinking eyes. His mouth twisted into a slight smile, as if he was amused by my confusion. I slammed my laptop shut, my heart racing. What had I gotten myself into? I sat there in the dark, staring at my closed laptop. My heart was pounding so hard I could feel it in my throat. How the hell did he know my name? I thought about opening the laptop again, checking the feed, but something deep inside me screamed not to. Instead, I just sat there, trying to make sense of it. Maybe it was a prank. Maybe the camera had some kind of two-way feature I didn't know about, like one of those nanny cams that let the person on the other end see who was watching. But that didn't explain how he knew my name. My mind raced through possibilities, but none of them made sense. I hadn't shared my personal information anywhere. The form I filled out was anonymous, just an email address and nothing more. Whoever this guy was, he shouldn't have known anything about me. I checked the clock. It was almost 4 a.m. My shift was technically over in an hour, but I wasn't going back to that feed. No way. I was about to shut everything down for the night when my phone buzzed on the table. I jumped, my nerves already shot. The screen lit up with a new notification, an email. I hesitated before picking up the phone, my fingers shaking as I unlocked it. The email was from the same address that had sent my job details earlier. "Finish your shift." That was all it said. 3 words, no subject line, no explanation, just a command. My stomach turned as I stared at the message. They were watching me. Somehow, they knew I had stopped. I looked around my apartment, half expecting to see cameras or someone lurking in the shadows, but it was just me, alone. I wanted to be done with it. The money wasn't worth this, whatever this was. But something kept gnawing at me. Curiosity, maybe. Or fear of what might happen if I didn't finish the job. I needed that money. I needed to know if this was all some sick joke or something worse. With shaky hands, I opened my laptop again. The feeds popped back up, the same as before. I scanned the screens, half expecting the man on camera 07 to still be staring at me. But to my relief, he was asleep again. His eyes were closed, his body motionless under the blankets. Everything looked normal. For a moment, I thought about skipping his feed altogether, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I needed to see this through. I clicked on camera 07 again, my heart pounding, as the image filled the screen. The man hadn't moved. His breathing was steady, his face relaxed. It was like nothing had happened at all. I exhaled slowly, trying to calm myself down. Maybe it had been a dream, some kind of sleep deprivation hallucination. I hadn't exactly been well rested these past few days. I watched him closely, waiting for something, anything, to happen. But as the minutes ticked by, nothing did. He just lay there, peacefully asleep. Then, something changed. The feed flickered. It was subtle at first, just a slight glitch in the image, like a momentary static. I thought it was just a bad connection, but then it happened again, this time longer. The screen flashed black for a split second, and when it returned, the room looked darker, as though the shadows in the corners had deepened. I leaned in closer, squinting at the screen. Something was wrong, but I couldn't quite place what it was. The man in the bed was still there, still sleeping, but the atmosphere felt off, like the room had taken on a different energy. Then the feed flickered again, longer this time. When the image came back, my breath caught in my throat. He was sitting up. I hadn't seen him move. 1 second he was lying down. The next, he was sitting upright, staring straight into the camera. His face was blank, emotionless, but his eyes, they were wide, unblinking, locked onto the lens. My fingers hovered over the keyboard, unsure of what to do. He wasn't supposed to wake up. He wasn't supposed to even know I was watching. And then, just like before, he spoke. "Why did you stop watching?" I froze, my body going cold. He wasn't just sleep-talking. This was directed at me. He knew. He knew I had closed the laptop earlier. I wanted to shut it down again, to throw my laptop across the room and never think about this again, but I couldn't. My eyes were glued to the screen. The man tilted his head slightly, his eyes narrowing as if he could see me through the camera. "You shouldn't have stopped." My pulse quickened. He was toying with me, speaking to me like he knew exactly what I was doing, what I was thinking. I sat there, paralyzed, unsure of what to do next. Should I respond? Was that even possible? Or was this some kind of elaborate hoax? Before I could decide, the screen flickered again. This time, the image didn't just glitch, it changed. The room around him began to warp, the walls twisting in on themselves, the shadows crawling up the ceiling like living things. The man didn't move, didn't react, but his eyes stayed fixed on mine, unblinking. I felt a wave of nausea hit me. This wasn't just some camera feed. Something was happening. Something I couldn't explain, but it was real. Too real. Suddenly, the room on the screen wasn't his anymore. It was mine. The camera feed now showed my own bedroom, dimly lit by the soft glow of my desk lamp. My bed was there, the blankets rumpled from where I'd been sitting just minutes ago. But the room was empty. I blinked, confusion flooding my mind. How could it be showing my room? And then, without warning, the man's voice came through the speakers one last time. "I'll see you soon." I stared at the screen, my heart hammering in my chest, unable to process what I was seeing. The camera feed, which just moments ago had shown a stranger's bedroom, now displayed my own room, empty, but undeniably mine. My bed, my desk, the same posters on the walls. How? How was this possible? The man's voice, his eerie, flat tone, still echoed in my head. "I'll see you soon." I felt sick, like the ground beneath me had shifted. I reached out and slammed the laptop shut, my hands shaking. My apartment was dead silent, but it didn't feel right anymore. The air was thick, like something was lurking just out of sight, watching me. I stood up slowly, my legs unsteady. Every instinct told me to leave, to get out, but where would I go? My thoughts raced, trying to come up with an explanation, but nothing made sense. Someone had hacked my computer, right? That had to be it. They were playing a sick game with me. But how did they get the camera feed of my room? I didn't even have a camera set up in here. I grabbed my phone and checked the time. 4:15 a.m. I was still shaking, the adrenaline pumping through me, but I had to calm down, had to think rationally. I decided to check my room. Maybe I'd been mistaken. Maybe it wasn't my room on the feed. It could have been something that just looked like it. But when I opened my bedroom door, my heart sank. It was exactly the way it looked on the screen. The blankets were pulled to the side, the lamp glowing softly. I looked around the room, feeling a chill crawl up my spine. There were no cameras here, no signs that anyone had been in my apartment at all. Everything was just as I had left it, except it wasn't. Something felt different. The air was colder, the shadows deeper, as though they were crawling along the walls, just like they had on the feed. My skin prickled, and every nerve in my body screamed that something wasn't right. I backed out of the room, closing the door behind me. I wasn't staying in there, not after what I'd seen. That's when I heard it, a faint knock at the front door. My heart stopped. I stood completely still, straining to listen. The knock came again, soft, deliberate. Whoever it was, they weren't in a rush. I glanced at the door, and the hairs on the back of my neck stood up. The peephole seemed darker than usual, as if something was blocking the light from outside. There was no way I was answering that door. Not at 4:30 in the morning, and definitely not after everything that had just happened. But the knocking didn't stop. It grew louder, more insistent, each knock sending a jolt of terror through me. I stepped back, moving as quietly as I could. My mind raced with possibility. Had they found me? Was this the man from the feed? How could he have gotten here so fast? My apartment building wasn't exactly easy to access. You needed a key fob to get in, and there were security cameras everywhere. But deep down, I knew the truth. Whoever, or whatever, was outside wasn't playing by normal rules. The knocking stopped. For a moment, the silence was worse than the sound of it. I waited, holding my breath, my body tensed and ready to run. Then from the other side of the door I heard it again. "I know you're in there." It was his voice, the same voice from the feed, the man who had spoken my name, the one who had watched me just as I had watched him. My heart raced, pounding so hard I thought it might burst. I backed up further, heading toward the kitchen, my eyes darting to every shadowed corner of my apartment. I didn't know what to do. I couldn't call the police. What would I even say? That some man I'd been spying on through a dark web job had tracked me down. Another knock, louder this time. I grabbed a kitchen knife, clutching it tightly, my hands shaking so badly that the blade wobbled in my grip. My brain screamed at me to do something, to fight, to run, anything. But I couldn't move. I was paralyzed by fear. Then the door handle turned. My breath hitched. It twisted slowly, like someone was testing it, seeing if it was unlocked. I thanked whatever instinct had told me to lock it earlier, but that didn't make me feel any safer. Whoever was outside knew I was here, and they weren't going to leave. The handle rattled again, more forcefully this time, and then, without warning, the knocking resumed. It wasn't slow or deliberate anymore. It was frantic, violent, like someone was pounding their fists against the door, trying to break it down. "Let me in," the voice shouted, its calm, eerie tone gone, replaced with something desperate, something hungry. I backed into the corner of the kitchen, knife still in hand, my back pressed against the cold tile wall. I squeezed my eyes shut, praying this wasn't real, that I'd wake up and it would all be some horrific nightmare. But the pounding continued, shaking the walls, filling the air with that relentless, hollow sound. Then As quickly as it had started, it stopped. The silence was deafening. My pulse pounded in my ears, and I strained to listen for any sign of movement, any hint that he was still there. But there was nothing. No footsteps, no voice, no knocking. I waited, my grip on the knife tightening with every passing second. Minutes dragged by, but still, nothing happened. I felt the tension in my body start to ease, just slightly. Maybe he was gone. Maybe whoever it was had given up. But then I heard it. Soft, almost imperceptible, a faint scratching sound. It was coming from inside the apartment. My stomach dropped. I turned slowly, dread twisting in my gut as I scanned the room. The sound was coming from the far corner, where the shadows seemed to pull, darker than anywhere else. It was like they were moving, shifting, growing deeper. And then, from the darkness, I heard the voice again. I told you, I'd see you soon. The voice coming from the corner of the room hit me like a punch in the gut. My whole body froze. My breath caught in my throat. The kitchen seemed smaller, darker, the walls pressing in as the air thickened with the weight of something I couldn't see. I told you, I'd see you soon. I turned slowly, my eyes locked on the dark corner where the sound had come from. The shadows there seemed to pulse, almost like they were alive, writhing and shifting in ways that didn't make sense. I tightened my grip on the knife, but it felt useless, like holding a toy against something far more powerful. The scratching sound returned, this time louder, more insistent, as if something was clawing its way through the walls. I backed up, my back pressing against the kitchen counter, trying to stay as far away from that corner as possible. But no matter how far I moved, I couldn't shake the feeling that the shadows were stretching toward me, reaching. A soft creak echoed through the room, like footsteps on old wood, but the floor beneath me was tile. I scanned the kitchen, eyes darting to every shadowed corner, every darkened doorway. It was too quiet now, too still, as if the very air had gone cold and lifeless. Suddenly, the overhead light flickered, once, twice, then cut out completely, plunging the apartment into near total darkness. The only light was the faint glow from my laptop in the other room, casting long, eerie shadows that seemed to shift with every flicker of the screen. Panic set in. I felt trapped, cornered, like prey waiting for the predator to strike. My mind raced, trying to make sense of what was happening, but there were no answers. Just the overwhelming fear that something was in here with me. Something unnatural. And then I heard it. Breathing. It was close. Too close. I whipped around, knife raised, but there was no one there, just the empty kitchen, the shadows, and the suffocating silence. But the breathing didn't stop. It was coming from behind me now, as if something, or someone, was standing just over my shoulder. I didn't dare turn around. Let me in, the voice whispered again, closer this time, as though it were right next to my ear. I squeezed my eyes shut, willing it all to stop, to go away, but the presence lingered, thick and suffocating. I could feel it now, the weight of something pressing down on me, cold fingers brushing the back of my neck. I snapped my eyes open, heart racing, and bolted toward the living room, knife still clutched in my hand. The apartment felt wrong, distorted, as though the walls were shifting, bending, closing in. Every step felt like I was moving through water, slow, heavy, my breath coming in short, panicked gasps. I reached the living room and slammed the door behind me, locking it with trembling hands. The scratching sound had stopped, but the silence that followed was worse. I stood there, back against the door, trying to steady my breathing, but the terror gnawing at me wouldn't let go. My eyes darted toward the laptop, still sitting on the coffee table. its screen casting a pale glow across the room. The camera feed was still active, showing the man's room from earlier, now empty and still. The bed was rumpled, the blankets twisted, but the man was gone. And then the screen flickered. A new image appeared. My living room. The same room I was standing in. The same angle, as if the camera had been watching me all along. I froze, my stomach churning with dread. The image showed me, standing by the door, knife in hand, staring at the screen. I was watching myself in real time. And then I saw it. Behind me, just barely visible in the edge of the frame, something moved. A shadow, darker than the rest, shifting ever so slightly. It was tall, its form distorted, like it was made of smoke, but it had shape. It had presence. I turned around slowly, the hairs on the back of my neck standing on end. At first, I saw nothing but darkness, the dim light from the laptop barely enough to illuminate the room. But as my eyes adjusted, I saw it. Standing in the corner, its face hidden in shadow, was a figure. It was tall, too tall, its arms hanging unnaturally at its sides, fingers twitching slightly. The thing's body seemed to flicker, like a broken video feed, there one moment, gone the next, and then it stepped forward. I stumbled back, nearly tripping over the coffee table as I raised the knife, but it felt pointless. Whatever this thing was, it wasn't human. It wasn't something I could fight. The figure moved closer, its footsteps silent, its form shifting and distorting with each step. I backed up until I hit the far wall, my breath coming in short, ragged gasps. My mind screamed at me to run, to do something, but I couldn't move. I was frozen, trapped by the thing's gaze, though it had no eyes, just an endless, hollow darkness where its face should have been. "Why are you hiding?" the voice whispered, that same cold, mocking tone. "You've been watching me all night. Now, it's my turn." I tried to scream, but no sound came out. My throat was dry, my body trembling as the figure reached out, its long, thin fingers stretching toward me, curling like claws. I pressed myself against the wall, knife raised, but the thing didn't stop. Its fingers brushed my arm, cold and sharp, like ice cutting through my skin. And then, just as quickly as it had appeared, it vanished. The room was empty again. The shadows were just shadows. My breath came in shallow bursts, my entire body trembling as I sank to the floor, dropping the knife beside me. I didn't understand. None of it made sense. I had seen it, felt it, but now it was gone. I glanced back at the laptop, and my blood ran cold. The screen had changed again. This time, there was a message, written in bold white letters across the black background. "This is only the beginning." The words on the screen, "This is only the beginning," glared back at me in the dim glow of my laptop. My mind spun, grasping for answers, but the terror in my gut left no room for logic. What did they mean by the beginning? What the hell had I gotten myself into? The apartment was still, unnervingly quiet. Too quiet. The only sound was the faint hum of the laptop, its screen casting long, jagged shadows across the room. The figure that had been standing in the corner was gone. Or at least, I thought it was gone. But the fear clung to me, like it was still there, watching, waiting. I was afraid to move, afraid to even breathe too loudly. Every creak of the floor, every whisper of wind outside made my heart skip a beat. My mind screamed at me to shut the laptop, to turn it off, to disconnect from whatever dark web hell I had tapped into. But I couldn't. Not yet. I needed answers. With shaky hands, I opened the laptop again, expecting to see more cryptic messages or another feed showing my apartment. But instead, the screen displayed A single button, black against the white background. Click to continue. I stared at it, my pulse quickening. I should have slammed the laptop shut right then, cut my losses, and walked away. But I couldn't shake the feeling that whatever had happened tonight, whatever had come after me, wasn't going to stop. Not unless I finished this. I clicked the button. The screen went black for a moment, and then slowly, a new image began to form. It wasn't a live feed this time, but a pre-recorded video, shaky and disorienting, like someone had filmed it with an old camcorder. The picture was grainy, washed out, but I recognized the place immediately. It was my apartment. The video started outside, the camera panning up to the front door, my front door. The angle was odd, like the person filming was crouching low, trying not to be seen. The timestamp in the corner showed it had been recorded just a few hours ago. While I was watching those feeds, my stomach twisted as the camera zoomed in on my door, the handle turning slowly. It was the same moment I had heard the knocking, the same moment I had stood in the kitchen, knife in hand, terrified. The door didn't open on the video. It stayed closed, but the camera lingered, almost like it was savoring the anticipation. Then, the screen flickered, and the scene changed. The camera was inside now, moving through my apartment. It was dark, but I could make out the familiar layout. My living room, the hallway leading to my bedroom. The person behind the camera wasn't making a sound. There was no breathing, no footsteps, just the slow, steady movement of the camera as it crept through my space. A knot formed in my throat as the camera reached the door to my bedroom. I remembered hearing the scratching sound from that direction, the subtle creak of something moving where it shouldn't have been. The camera stopped just outside the door, the lens focusing on the crack between the floor and the door. And then, without warning, the door swung open. There I was, lying in bed, fast asleep, completely oblivious to the camera creeping toward me. My heart dropped as I watched myself on the screen, my chest rising and falling with slow, steady breaths. The room was dark, but there was enough light for me to see the shadow in the corner. The same shadow that had been watching me. It was standing over me. The figure was tall, looming over my sleeping form like a predator sizing up its prey. I watched, frozen in horror, as the figure bent down, its face, if you could even call it that, coming closer to mine. The camera zoomed in on the scene, capturing every terrifying second of it, and then the figure leaned in close to my ear and whispered something. I couldn't make out the words. The audio was too muffled, too distorted. But whatever it said, my sleeping self reacted. I shifted in bed, murmuring something in response, as if I were having a conversation with the thing. As if, in my sleep, I knew it was there. The video cut to black. I slammed the laptop shut, my heart racing, sweat dripping down my face. This was real, all of it. I had no idea how long that thing had been watching me, or how many nights it had stood over me while I slept. But now I knew for sure it was inside my apartment. I bolted up from the couch, adrenaline kicking in as I searched for my phone. I needed help. I needed to get out of here. But as I grabbed my phone off the table, I noticed something that made my blood run cold. The screen showed a missed call. The caller ID read unknown, but the time was 3:33 a.m., the exact moment I had heard the knocking at my door. I dropped the phone, my hands trembling, and backed away from the table. The room felt like it was closing in on me, the shadows thickening, stretching. I could hear it again, the soft scratching sound from earlier, but now it was coming from all around me, surrounding me. Then from the corner of the room, that voice came back, soft, almost gentle. We're not finished yet. I didn't wait to see what came next. I grabbed my jacket, threw open the door, and ran. I didn't stop until I was far away from the building, until the night swallowed me whole, and I was sure, certain, that the thing wasn't following me. I don't know how long I wandered the streets that night, trying to make sense of what had happened. All I knew was that I couldn't go back. Not to that apartment, not to the laptop, not to anything tied to that dark web job. I deleted the email account the next day, smashed the laptop too. But the fear hasn't left. I still feel it sometimes, when I'm alone, when the night gets too quiet, like something is watching me, waiting. I was paid to test a new surgical procedure for faster healing. Now, my scars are moving. All right, here goes nothing. I'm not really the type to post on here, but recent events, they've left me feeling like I don't have many options. Maybe you guys can help make sense of this, or at least keep me from losing my mind. I'll start from the beginning, though it feels strange to put it all into words. I've been tight on cash for a while now, working odd jobs, picking up whatever I can online just to scrape by. One day, I stumbled on a post buried in an obscure online forum, something along the lines of, looking for participants for a new, cutting-edge medical procedure. The ad was weirdly vague, but it mentioned good money for reliable candidates. Honestly, I didn't even know if it was real. But curiosity got the best of me. And well, let's just say when you're living off instant noodles, even a sketchy sounding job is worth a second look. The money was way more than I'd expected, enough to cover rent for a couple of months. All I had to do was test a breakthrough in medical science. At first, I thought it was some sort of scam, but the guy who messaged me back seemed professional. He had a medical background, he said, and was just conducting a small-scale experiment under strict supervision. He said he couldn't get into too many details, but assured me it was safe and that I'd be monitored the whole time. I didn't have to sign any sketchy NDAs or go to a basement lab or anything, just a regular clinic. Anyway, I went in, met this guy who called himself Dr. Axton. Young, maybe early 30s, clean cut, and super friendly. The clinic was your typical sterile, white-walled place with that faint chemical smell, nothing unusual. He talked me through the process, saying it was a minor surgical adjustment that would encourage the body to heal faster. Apparently, it was supposed to work on everything from small cuts to major wounds. At this point, I was feeling skeptical, but I don't know. He had this way of talking, like he'd done this 1,000 times. Plus, the money was hard to say no to. I signed a few forms, which, yeah, I probably should have read more carefully, and agreed to start right away. The whole thing was over in less than an hour. They did a small incision on my arm, applied some sort of gel, then stitched it back up with this special thread. Dr. Axton was calm, guiding me through the whole process. I didn't feel much of anything besides a bit of pressure. Afterward, they put this weird, high-tech bandage over it, told me it would dissolve on its own after a few days, and sent me home. For the first couple of days, everything seemed normal. The incision healed way faster than I expected. By day 3, it was almost as if the wound had been there for weeks, not days. The skin looked smooth, with barely a scar. I remember thinking, wow, this is actually legit. Maybe I scored a pretty good deal here. Then, things started to get strange. On day 5, I was checking out the incision when I noticed something odd. It looked like the scar was shifting. Not in any dramatic way, but I swear, it wasn't in the exact same place as before. I tried to convince myself it was just my imagination. Maybe I'd been staring at it too long. But the next morning, it was definitely different. It was lower on my arm, just by a fraction, but unmistakable. I tried not to panic. I mean, what could I even tell anyone? Hey, my scar is moving on its own? Yeah, real convincing. Over the next few days, it kept shifting, each time by just a little. I tried taking pictures to keep track, but when I looked at them later, they didn't show anything strange. Just an ordinary scar. I was starting to feel like I was losing it. I'd catch myself staring at it, almost like I was waiting for it to move while I watched. But, of course, it never did. Only when I'd look away for a while and then check again, that's when it seemed to change positions. The next time I went in for a checkup, I told Dr. Axton about it. He gave me this weird look, his friendly smile slipping just a little. "Oh, that's interesting," he said, nodding slowly, like he was thinking it over. But then he assured me it was just the tissue adjusting, a normal part of the healing process. Our bodies are always shifting and changing, he said, which sounded like the kind of answer they give when they don't know what else to say. Still, he did a full examination, checked my vitals, and said everything looked excellent. Before I left, he gave me his personal number in case I had any more questions, which struck me as odd. He even put a hand on my shoulder and said, "Don't hesitate to reach out if you notice anything else unusual." The thing is, I hadn't told him the full story. I hadn't told him about the dreams. Since the surgery, I'd been having these, I don't know, weird flashes. They weren't exactly nightmares, but they left me feeling unsettled, like I was seeing pieces of something that didn't belong to me. I'd be sitting in a dark room with bright, glaring lights above, my hands strapped to a chair, hearing faint whispers I couldn't make out. Sometimes, I'd wake up with my heart pounding, my arm aching, as if I'd just scratched at it all night. Part of me wanted to believe Dr. Axton. I wanted to believe this was just my mind playing tricks on me, or maybe some weird side effect of the healing gel. But the more I stared at that scar, the harder it got to convince myself. And then, one morning, I woke up to find the scar had shifted again. Only this time, it wasn't just a little. It had moved from my forearm to my wrist. And there, just above the scar, I saw something I hadn't noticed before. A faint, barely visible symbol etched into my skin, almost like a brand. I'm not going to lie. I felt a chill go through me when I saw that symbol. It was small, faint, barely there at all, but the shape of it was unmistakable. A circle with 3 tiny lines branching out from the bottom, like some twisted version of a tree. I tried to rub it off, thinking maybe it was some kind of ink or residue from the bandage, but it didn't fade. It was like the thing was under my skin. The scar hadn't just shifted to my wrist, it had completely changed. It was smoother somehow, the edges more rounded, almost like a tattoo rather than a scar. I sat there in my room, turning my wrist over in the early morning light, wondering what the hell I'd signed myself up for. I decided I couldn't just sit around and pretend this was all normal. I pulled out my phone and called Dr. Axton, figuring if anyone had an explanation, it would be him. The call went straight to voicemail, so I left a message, trying to keep my voice steady, saying I'd noticed some unexpected effects and needed to talk. I spent the day trying not to think about it, even went out for a bit, hoping maybe a change of scenery would calm me down. But all day, I could feel this weird tingling sensation around my wrist, almost like the scar was itching beneath the skin. And every so often, I'd catch myself looking down, expecting the symbol to have vanished or shifted again. It never did, just sat there, this tiny mark that I was starting to feel more and more aware of, like a splinter lodged too deep to reach. Later that evening, Dr. Axton finally called back. His voice was as calm as ever, but there was this slight hesitation when I told him about the symbol, like he'd been expecting it, but didn't want to admit it. He asked if I could come into the clinic first thing in the morning, and I agreed, though a part of me wanted to back out, tell him I'd changed my mind. But I knew this was too far past weird to ignore. That night, I had another one of those dreams, except this time, it felt different, more vivid. I was in the same dimly lit room, strapped to that chair, but this time I could make out more details. There were surgical tools laid out on a tray beside me, gleaming under a harsh fluorescent light. And in the shadows beyond the light, I could hear those whispers again, louder now, like voices just out of reach. But here's where things get stranger. In the dream, I looked down at my arm and saw not just the scar, but more of those symbols, crawling up my skin like a twisted vine. My chest tightened, a cold sweat breaking out as I tried to scream, to rip myself free, but no sound came out. Just as I thought I was going to suffocate, I jolted awake, gasping for air, my entire body drenched in sweat. The scar on my wrist throbbed painfully, like it had been burned. In the dark, I switched on my bedside lamp and checked my wrist, half expecting the scar to be gone or change somehow. But it was exactly the same, except for the symbol. Now it was clearer, like it had darkened overnight. By the time I got to the clinic the next morning, I was exhausted and probably looked it. Dr. Axton greeted me with that same friendly smile, though his eyes seemed to linger a bit longer on my wrist. He led me to a back room I hadn't seen before, smaller and less polished than the others, more like a storage area. He asked me to sit down and started examining my wrist with these tiny tools, muttering to himself as he moved the skin around the scar. "This shouldn't be happening," he finally said, and there was a strange edge to his voice that I hadn't heard before. When I asked him what he meant, he just shook his head, his eyes never leaving the scar. He started talking about unexpected side effects, something about the body reacting to the treatment in unpredictable ways. But when I pressed him, he went quiet, almost like he was hiding something. And then he asked something that caught me completely off guard. "Have you experienced anything unusual outside of the scar? Strange dreams, maybe?" I didn't know how to respond. The fact that he even mentioned dreams felt like he knew more than he was letting on. I told him about the flashes, the strange whispers, hoping he'd laugh it off or reassure me it was normal. Instead, he just nodded, looking even more concerned. "That's not unheard of," he murmured, almost to himself, like he was weighing his words. "We've seen similar phenomena in previous participants, though not usually this intense." "Previous participants?" I asked, a shiver running down my spine. "You mean this has happened before?" Dr. Axton looked at me, that professional mask slipping just a bit, and for the first time I could see something like regret in his eyes. "I shouldn't be telling you this, but this procedure, it's still in the experimental phase. Most participants don't report any side effects, but there have been a few anomalies. Anomalies." The word felt too casual for what I'd been going through, like he was talking about a software glitch instead of the things I'd seen and felt. I pushed him for details, but he just shook his head, saying he couldn't share specifics due to confidentiality. All he offered was a vague reassurance, saying they'd keep an eye on it and make adjustments if necessary. Then he handed me a cream, some kind of numbing agent, and told me to apply it if the scar started to itch again. It'll help calm the area, he said, though something about the way he said it made me wonder if it was really for the itch or something else entirely. As I was leaving, I glanced over my shoulder and saw him watching me, that same worried expression on his face, like he knew something was going to happen that he wasn't telling me about. I could feel his eyes on me all the way down the hall. When I got home, I put the cream on, hoping it would help, but the itching only seemed to get worse. That night, as I lay in bed, my wrist started to burn. It was faint at first, but then it grew, pulsing in time with my heartbeat. I stared at the ceiling, feeling that crawling sensation spread up my arm, like the scar was digging deeper into my skin. I must have fallen asleep eventually, but I woke up around midnight, my arm feeling heavy and numb. I turned on the light, groggy and half panicked, and lifted my wrist to check the scar. My breath caught in my throat. The scar had moved again. It was now winding its way up my forearm like a thin, jagged path carved into my skin. And worse, the symbol had changed. It was no longer a single mark, but two, side by side, like they were multiplying. I wanted to scream, but I just sat there, frozen, staring at those symbols that seemed to pulse with each beat of my heart. And that's when I realized they looked like eyes. I didn't sleep much after that. Every time I closed my eyes, those symbols, the eyes, seemed to stare back at me. Their shapes burned into my mind. I kept telling myself, this had to be some sort of reaction to the procedure. Maybe the scar tissue just looked weird. But deep down, I knew that was a lie. Whatever was happening, it wasn't natural. It was as if something was growing inside me, creeping further up my arm each time I dared to look. The next morning, I decided enough was enough. Dr. Axton had danced around too many questions, dodged every chance to explain the side effects, and I was starting to suspect he knew exactly what was going on. I grabbed my phone and tried calling him again, only to be met with the same voicemail greeting as before. I left another message, more urgent this time, but I had a sinking feeling I wouldn't be hearing back. That night, things took a turn for the worse. It started around midnight, a strange scratching noise coming from somewhere outside my apartment. At first, I ignored it, assuming it was just some stray animal or a tree branch brushing against the window. But it didn't stop. It just kept going. This faint, persistent sound, like nails scraping against glass. I sat up in bed, heart pounding, and looked toward the window. The blinds were shut, but the scratching continued, a slow, deliberate rhythm that was almost too human. I could feel every hair on the back of my neck stand up as I stared at the blinds, waiting for the noise to stop. But it didn't. Just as I was about to get up, the scratching stopped. I held my breath, listening to the silence that followed, every muscle in my body tense. And then, in the quiet, I heard something else. Faint, muffled voices, as if they were coming from the hallway outside my apartment. It was hard to make out what they were saying, but there was something about their tone that sent a chill down my spine. They sounded excited, almost eager. I forced myself to get out of bed, heart racing, and slowly made my way to the front door. The voices grew louder as I approached, but they were still too quiet to understand. I pressed my ear against the door, straining to make out the words, and that's when I heard it. A low, rasping whisper, right on the other side of the door. "He's ready," the voice hissed, so close I could feel the vibration through the wood. "The marks are forming." I stumbled back, covering my mouth to keep from gasping out loud. I couldn't believe what I just heard. They were talking about me. Whoever was outside my door knew about the symbols, about the scar, about everything. I backed away slowly, trying not to make a sound, but then I heard the handle turn, and a soft knock echoed through the silence. "Hello?" A voice called out, soft and calm, almost friendly. "We'd like to speak with you. We just need a moment of your time." I didn't respond, didn't move. I just stood there, frozen, watching the doorknob twist back and forth as they tried to open the door. The whispering started up again. Multiple voices this time, speaking in low tones I couldn't understand. They seemed to be arguing, hissing, back and forth, as if they were debating what to do next. And then, just as suddenly as it had started, everything went silent. I stayed there, barely daring to breathe, listening for any sign that they were still there. After a few minutes, I heard the faint sound of footsteps retreating down the hall. I waited a while longer, heart hammering in my chest, before finally daring to look through the peephole. The hallway was empty, no sign of anyone, but there was something on the floor just outside my door, a small, white envelope lying there like a gift left by some twisted secret Santa. I didn't want to open it, but I couldn't just leave it there either. I waited until morning, hoping that daylight would make everything feel less terrifying. But when I finally picked it up and tore it open, I realized there was nothing comforting about it. Inside was a single sheet of paper with one line, typed in neat, clinical font. "Your progress has been remarkable. We'll be seeing you soon." That was it. No signature, no company name, just a warning, plain as day. I crumpled the paper in my fist, feeling a surge of anger mixed with fear. Whoever these people were, they were watching me, tracking my every move. And now, they'd made it clear, they weren't done with me. The next few days passed in a haze of paranoia. I kept my curtains closed, avoided leaving the apartment unless absolutely necessary. Every night, I heard that same scratching sound at the window, the faint whispers echoing in the hall, but I didn't dare check the peephole again. I just sat in bed, clutching my phone, waiting for it all to stop. But the worst part was the scar. It had spread even further, creeping up past my elbow, the symbols multiplying, forming an intricate pattern that seemed almost deliberate, like a map or a code. I'd stare at it for hours, tracing the lines, trying to understand what it meant, but the more I looked, the more unsettled I felt. It was as if the symbols were alive, pulsing faintly beneath the surface, waiting for something. Then, one night, I woke up to a sharp burning pain in my arm. I threw off the covers, heart pounding, and saw that the scar was glowing faintly in the dark, the symbols shining like embers. I could feel it moving, shifting beneath the skin, twisting and writhing, like something was trying to break free. And that's when I heard the voice. Not from outside, not through the door, but inside my head. "You belong to us now," it whispered, soft and cold, the words echoing in my mind like a terrible lullaby. There's no going back. I scrambled out of bed, clutching my arm, desperate to get away from the sound, but it followed me, relentless, growing louder with each step. I stumbled into the bathroom, turned on the light, and looked at my reflection, hoping that somehow, by facing it head on, I could make it stop. But what I saw in the mirror wasn't my own reflection. It was a face, twisted and warped, with too many eyes and a mouth that stretched impossibly wide. The symbols covered its skin, crawling like insects, each one blinking and shifting in a grotesque dance. And as I watched, paralyzed with horror, the reflection lifted a hand and smiled, a slow, deliberate grin that seemed to say, "We're just getting started." Then in a flash, it was gone, replaced by my own pale, trembling face, staring back at me. The voice faded, leaving me alone in the silence. But I knew deep down, that it was only a matter of time before they came for me again. The scar was still there, burning faintly, the symbols etched into my skin like a brand, and somehow I knew that the next time they knocked, there would be no turning them away. By now, I wasn't sleeping. Every time I closed my eyes, I could feel the symbols, like tiny crawling flames etched beneath my skin. I'd lie there in the dark, feeling them pulse in time with my heartbeat. A constant, unsettling reminder that something inside me was changing. Worse, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched, that even in the silence of my apartment, I was somehow never alone. After the incident in the bathroom, I couldn't bring myself to look in the mirror again. I kept expecting to see it staring back at me, that twisted, impossible face with eyes that shouldn't exist. I'd catch glimpses of my reflection in the darkened screen of my phone or the glass of a window, and each time I felt this awful sense of dread, like I was seeing a stranger's face instead of my own. And then, as if things couldn't get worse, I got a call from an unknown number. I didn't want to answer. Every rational part of me was screaming to ignore it, to throw my phone out the window and never look back. But some twisted curiosity made me swipe to answer, bringing the phone slowly to my ear. "Hello?" I whispered, my voice barely steady. There was silence on the other end, and for a second I thought maybe it was just a glitch or a prank call. But then, a low, static-filled voice crackled through the line. "We have something for you. Check your mailbox." The line went dead. I stared at the screen, heart pounding, trying to tell myself it was just another nightmare, that I'd wake up any minute. But the phone was still in my hand, the call log on the screen, all too real. I waited until morning before I dared to go outside. The hallway was empty, eerily quiet, as I made my way to the mailboxes at the end. My hands were shaking as I unlocked mine, half expecting it to be empty. But there, sitting alone at the bottom, was a small, unmarked package. I took it back to my apartment, locking the door behind me before ripping it open. Inside was an old, scratched-up VHS tape, unlabeled, with nothing to indicate what was on it or where it had come from. I stared at it, dread curling in my stomach. Who even used VHS tapes anymore? I didn't own a VCR, so I had to dig through some old listings online until I found a place that still rented them out. The guy at the shop gave me a weird look when I asked if he had one, but I didn't care. I paid in cash, barely listening to his warnings about late fees and damage charges, my mind consumed by whatever was on that tape. Back in my apartment, I hooked up the VCR, trying to ignore the fact that my hands were shaking so hard I could barely get the cables plugged in. Finally, I slipped the tape in, my stomach twisting as it whirred to life, filling the screen with static. At first, there was nothing but that grainy black and white fuzz. I waited, feeling my anxiety build with every second, and then, slowly, an image began to take shape on the screen. It was a room, small, dimly lit, with walls covered in strange symbols that looked disturbingly similar to the ones on my arm. A single chair sat in the center of the room, and in it was a figure bound and gagged, their heads slumped forward, hair hanging over their face. I couldn't see who it was, but something about their posture, the way their shoulders shook, it felt all too familiar. The camera zoomed in slowly, focusing on the figure's arm, where a long, jagged scar twisted around their wrist, identical to mine. My breath caught in my throat as I realized what I was looking at. It was me. The image on the screen jerked, the camera shifting, as if someone was standing behind it, breathing heavily. A low voice, barely more than a whisper, crackled through the speakers. "You're part of something special now," it said, each word dripping with a twisted sense of satisfaction. "A vessel, a doorway. Soon you'll understand." The screen flickered, and for a brief moment I saw the face again, the one from the mirror, that impossibly wide grin, the eyes blinking in unnatural patterns across its face. It leaned close to the camera, filling the screen, its gaze locked onto mine. I couldn't look away, hypnotized by those shifting eyes that seemed to follow me no matter where I moved. And then the screen went dark. I sat there, staring at the blank screen, my mind racing. I could still feel that awful grin burned into my mind, the weight of its gaze lingering even after it was gone. My arm throbbed painfully, and when I looked down, I saw that the symbols had spread again, twisting up past my elbow, almost reaching my shoulder. I knew, without a doubt, that whatever had been done to me, whatever I'd agreed to, it was far from over. I couldn't just wait around, letting this thing take over. I had to find Dr. Axton, confront him, force him to tell me what he'd done. I didn't know where else to go or who to turn to. All I knew was that he was the only one with answers. I left the apartment in a rush, the VHS tapes still playing, on repeat in the back of my mind. The clinic was a half-hour drive away, but I barely noticed the time passing, my thoughts tangled in a mess of fear and rage. When I arrived, the building was dark, the doors locked, a small sign on the front window reading "Closed for renovations." I pounded on the door, hoping someone would hear me, but there was no answer. I looked around, feeling desperation claw at my chest, and noticed a back entrance hidden in the alley. I tried the handle, and to my surprise, it opened. Inside, the clinic was dark and silent, every room empty. I searched every hallway, calling out for Dr. Axton, but it was like the entire place had been abandoned overnight. And then, just as I was about to give up, I found something that made my blood run cold. In one of the back rooms, half covered by a tarp, was a familiar chair, the same one I'd seen in the video. It sat alone in the middle of the room, the leather worn and cracked, with faint stains on the armrests. Above it, scrawled in red paint across the wall, was a single line: "Welcome to the family." I backed away, my heart hammering, and turned to leave. But before I could, I felt a cold hand grip my shoulder. I froze, every muscle tensing, as a familiar voice whispered in my ear, "You can't run from us. You're ours now." I spun around, but there was no one there, just the empty room, the eerie silence pressing in around me. The symbols on my arm burned hotter than ever, searing into my skin like brands, and I stumbled out of the clinic, gasping for air. By the time I made it back to my car, the symbols had spread all the way up my arm, twisting around my shoulder, crawling up my neck. I looked in the rearview mirror, and there, on my own face, were the faint outlines of those terrible shifting eyes, blinking slowly, watching me through my own skin. I could feel them, alive and aware, digging deeper with each passing second. And as I sat there, trembling, I realized the awful truth. I wasn't just being haunted by them, I was becoming them. By the time I got back to my apartment, I was half certain they were already inside me. Not just the symbols or the eyes, but them. Like I was some hollowed out vessel they were filling, piece by piece. I could feel them crawling beneath my skin, settling into every muscle, every nerve, as if they were rearranging me from the inside. I locked the door, threw every bolt I could, and shut off all the lights. Maybe it was stupid, but I thought that if I just hid in the dark, I could slow whatever was happening, that maybe they wouldn't see me in the shadows. For a while, it was quiet, just me, sitting in the dark. my thoughts spinning in a mess of dread and confusion. I kept replaying the things Dr. Axton had said, those cryptic, unsettling phrases. A vessel, a doorway. Every word seemed to echo in my head, louder and louder, until it was all I could hear. And then, like a whisper breaking through the silence, I heard it again. The scratching. It started at the window, soft and slow, like nails scraping against the glass. I clenched my fists, trying to steady my breathing. But the scratching only grew louder, sharper, like they were clawing their way inside. Then it moved, sliding down to my door, tapping lightly at first, then harder, as if they were testing the strength of the lock. "Come out," a voice murmured from the other side, low and taunting, with that familiar twisted tone. "You're one of us now. Let us in." I couldn't move, couldn't breathe. The symbols on my arm pulsed, bright and hot, and I watched, horrified, as they spread even further, curling around my throat like a noose. I could feel them tightening, inch by inch, as if they were trying to suffocate me from the inside out. And then, just as the pressure became unbearable, the scratching stopped. The silence that followed was even worse, thick and suffocating, like the air itself was pressing down on me. I sat there, waiting, listening to my own heartbeat pounding in my ears. Then slowly, the lights in my apartment began to flicker. One by one, each bulb flared and dimmed, casting long, eerie shadows that danced across the walls. And in those shadows, I saw them, figures shifting, faces half-formed, eyes blinking, and mouths twisting into wide, unnatural grins. They didn't speak, didn't move toward me. They just watched, their gazes piercing, as if they were studying me, waiting for something. I tried to look away, to close my eyes, but it was like they were inside my head, pulling me back, forcing me to stare. And then, in the silence, I heard a voice, a deep, rumbling whisper that seemed to come from everywhere at once. "You are the doorway," it said, each word vibrating through my bones. "We needed a body, a vessel. You let us in." The realization hit me like a punch to the gut. This whole thing, the procedure, the scar, the dreams, it was never about healing. It was about creating a way in, a bridge between them and us. And now, I was the bridge. I stumbled backward, desperate to escape, but it was too late. The symbols were spreading faster now, racing up my face, across my chest, covering every inch of skin in that pulsing, fiery pattern. I could feel them burrowing deeper, like roots, sinking into the earth, anchoring themselves into every part of me. And then, with a sudden, blinding pain, I felt them fully awaken inside me. It was like a floodgate opening, a rush of sensations and memories that weren't mine, images flashing through my mind in a dizzying blur, dark rooms filled with flickering lights, whispered incantations, faces twisted in pain and ecstasy. I saw their world, a place of shadows and twisted shapes where nothing was solid, nothing human. I tried to scream, but no sound came out. My voice wasn't my own anymore. It was theirs. I could feel them taking control, inch by inch, twisting my limbs, stretching my mouth into that same wide, impossible grin. "Thank you," the voice inside me whispered, echoing in my mind with a cold, mocking tone. "You have served your purpose well. Now, let us show you ours." My vision blurred, and for a moment I could see both worlds, the dark, twisted realm they came from, merging with the reality around me, warping it into something nightmarish. The walls of my apartment shifted, turning into a strange, pulsating black substance that seemed to breathe, and the shadows grew thicker, solidifying into figures with too many eyes, and too many mouths. They surrounded me, their hands reaching out, their fingers merging with my skin, pulling me deeper into their world. I could feel my own identity slipping, my thoughts becoming theirs, my memories fading as they flooded my mind with their own. In my last moments of clarity, I looked down at my arm, at the symbols that had once been a simple scar, and I understood. I was never just a test subject. I was a sacrifice, a willing participant in a ritual I hadn't even known existed. They hadn't just healed me. They'd marked me, claimed me, prepared me for something far beyond human understanding. And as the last shreds of my own consciousness faded, replaced by the cold, alien presence that now filled every part of me, I realized there was no escape. I was gone, swallowed up by something far older, far darker than anything I could have imagined. I am the doorway now, and they are on the other side, waiting. And soon, they'll be coming for you too. I participated in a dark web study to expand human senses. Now, I can hear things no one else can. Alright, so, I don't know how to start this without sounding crazy, but here we go. I've never been the type to dive into weird stuff online. Sure, I'd read creepy stories on forums or watch strange videos, but it was all at a safe distance, you know. I liked the thrill without getting in over my head. That changed a few weeks ago when I stumbled onto a forum that shouldn't have been on my radar. I was just browsing on the dark web out of curiosity. I'd heard enough horror stories to know that most people never go deeper than some sketchy chat rooms or videos. But that night was different. I couldn't sleep, and boredom mixed with curiosity had me clicking through site after site until I ended up on this forum. And there, I saw a post titled, "Paid Study to Expand Human Senses. Serious Inquiries Only." Now, I'm not gonna lie, the money part caught my eye. They were offering $1,000 just to participate. That's a lot of cash for me, and I was in between jobs. Plus, the description was vague enough to be intriguing. It talked about a revolutionary new way to experience the world, using phrases like unlocking human potential and pushing boundaries of perception. All I had to do was trust the process. Looking back, that should have been my first red flag. But I've always been the type to brush off warnings as overblown hype. I thought, what's the worst that could happen? And clicked the link. It led me to a plain black page with a single text box asking for my email and a checkbox agreeing to a non-disclosure agreement. That was it. No terms and conditions, no names or affiliations. And yet, the whole thing had this eerie legitimacy to it. Like they didn't care if you thought it was shady because they didn't need to explain themselves. I took a deep breath, typed in my info, and hit submit. A couple of hours later, I got an email. It contained an address, a date, and a single line. Come, prepared to embrace a new reality. No signature, nothing. Just that. And yeah, I should have known better, but I was curious, broke, and maybe a little reckless. The location wasn't too far from me, a nondescript building on the outskirts of the city. It looked abandoned, which somehow made it feel more like something out of a movie. The day came, and as I walked to the place, I remember feeling this odd mix of excitement and dread. The building was hidden behind overgrown shrubs and covered in graffiti. I double-checked the address, half expecting to be pranked or something, but it matched perfectly. Inside, I found a single elevator that looked like it hadn't been used in decades. The button worked, though, and I stepped in, feeling like I was descending into a different world. The doors opened to this narrow hallway with fluorescent lights flickering overhead. leading to a door labeled testing room. I don't know if it was the eerie silence or the way the lights buzzed, but I almost backed out right then. But when I pushed the door open, I was surprised. The room was clean, sterile, almost like a doctor's office. There was a single chair in the center, facing a huge monitor. A woman in a lab coat, who looked way too normal to be working in a place like this, greeted me. "Glad you made it," she said with a smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. "You can call me Dr. Hayes." She didn't waste any time explaining. "Today, we're going to help you perceive things beyond the normal spectrum. You'll be exposed to certain frequencies that have been theorized to expand human senses. This might cause discomfort, but I assure you it's all safe." I was about to ask questions, but before I could, she nodded toward the chair and gestured for me to sit. She strapped a pair of headphones over my ears, then adjusted a small device on the table beside me that looked like a regular radio, but with way too many dials. "Remember, you're in control. If it's too much, just raise your hand and we'll stop," she said, and something in her tone made me think that was more of a formality than an actual option. With a flip of a switch, I felt this intense hum in my ears, like a bass drop in a song, but constant, vibrating through my skull. At first it wasn't bad, it was almost soothing, but as she adjusted the dial, the sound shifted, climbing in pitch until it felt like it was burrowing into my head. My vision started to blur around the edges, and I could swear I heard whispers, like faint voices hidden beneath the hum. They were garbled, unintelligible, but familiar, like when you catch a phrase on the tip of your tongue. "Can you hear anything?" she asked, sounding too calm for the situation. I nodded, my heartbeat quickening. The whispers grew louder, more distinct, but they weren't like anything I'd heard before. They felt layered, almost like they were coming from inside my head. I caught words, random and strange, like a dream. Shadow, waiting, hunger, coming. I raised my hand, but it felt numb. The whispers turned into murmurs, and suddenly, the sound cut off. Dr. Hayes removed the headphones and looked at me with this strange expression, like she was studying me. "Well done," she said, but it felt rehearsed, detached. I didn't even ask any questions. I just took the money and left, my head pounding. But since that day, things have been different. At first, I thought it was nothing, maybe just side effects from the frequencies or my brain adjusting. But then I started hearing things when I was alone, not voices or whispers, nothing like that. Just sounds that no one else could hear. A dripping faucet in the middle of the night when the taps were all dry. Footsteps in the hallway that stopped as soon as I listened harder. Sometimes, it was as if someone was breathing right beside me, just outside my field of vision. And now, I'm stuck with this nagging feeling that whatever I unlocked that day hasn't gone away, that it's waiting for something. Or maybe someone. For days after that session, my world felt wrong. It wasn't like I was hallucinating or anything dramatic like that. It was more like the edges of everything had softened, like I'd been nudged just slightly out of sync with reality. Sounds I'd taken for granted, like the hum of my refrigerator or the distant rumble of traffic, now seemed alive, layered with strange distortions that I couldn't pinpoint. The nights were worse. The strange sounds I'd heard that first night grew louder, creeping up on me when I was alone in the quiet. I'd be sitting in my living room, trying to watch TV, when the sound of footsteps would start up in the hallway behind me. They weren't heavy, nothing you'd call a stomp, but they were distinct, slow, like someone was pacing, pausing just long enough to make me doubt I'd heard anything at all. I'd sit frozen, straining to catch another sound, but the minute I'd actually focus, The footsteps would stop. It was the kind of thing that made my skin crawl. I told myself it was just leftover tension from that experiment, that my mind was filling in blanks where there were none. But telling myself that and believing it were two different things. One night, I decided to record it. If there was something, anything, going on, maybe I could catch it on audio and put my mind at ease. I set up my phone's voice recorder, put it on the coffee table, and let it run while I pretended to watch TV. Just like clockwork, the sound started again, soft but unmistakable. I kept my eyes glued to the screen, pretending I didn't notice, while every hair on my body stood on end. When the sound faded, I hit stop on the recorder, half relieved, half dreading what I might find. I plugged in my headphones, hit play, and waited. At first, I heard nothing out of the ordinary. The background noise of the TV, the soft hum of my breathing. But then, it changed. Right around the 3-minute mark, the faintest sound crept in, a raspy, rhythmic noise, like someone dragging a piece of sandpaper along wood. As it grew louder, I realized it was breathing, labored, uneven, like someone struggling for air. My heart pounded as I strained to make out the details, but there was something else, too, faint, almost hidden beneath the gasps. A voice, low and guttural, repeating something under its breath. I rewound it, listening over and over, but I couldn't quite make out the words. And then, just as the breathing faded, there was this soft, almost mocking laugh, a quick, breathy sound, like it was right next to the microphone. My blood ran cold. It wasn't my laugh, and there was no one else in my apartment. I deleted the recording immediately. I didn't want to know what was on it anymore. I thought that would be the end of it, that maybe whatever I'd picked up would leave me alone if I ignored it. But the next night, the sounds changed again. This time, it wasn't footsteps or breathing. I was lying in bed, half asleep, when I heard a new noise. It was faint at first, barely a whisper, but it grew louder, closer, until I could make it out clearly. It was the sound of scratching, like fingernails scraping along wood, coming from inside the walls. I tried to ignore it, pulling the covers over my head, but it kept going, relentless. My mind raced with every logical explanation. Rats, creaking pipes, maybe even the building settling. But deep down, I knew it wasn't any of those things. It was too deliberate, too rhythmic. And the worst part? Every time I moved or shifted, the scratching would stop, only to start up again once I settled back down. After what felt like hours, I couldn't take it anymore. I turned on every light in my apartment, hoping the brightness would chase away whatever was lurking in the dark. I stayed up all night, pacing my living room, clutching my phone in case I needed to call someone. But who would I call? What could I even say? The following day, I was exhausted, running on fumes. Every sound, every creak felt amplified, and I was jumpy, like I was waiting for something to happen. And it didn't take long. That evening, I was washing dishes when I felt a strange sensation, a tingling pressure at the base of my skull, like someone was watching me. I turned, expecting to find an empty room, but instead, I saw something. It was only there for a split second, just a shadow in my peripheral vision, but it looked wrong, twisted, almost contorted. I blinked, and it was gone, leaving me staring at nothing but empty air. I told myself I was just tired, that my mind was playing tricks on me, but the feeling lingered. That night, when I went to bed, I left the light on, something I hadn't done since I was a kid. I lay there, staring at the ceiling, too scared to close my eyes when I heard it again. The laughter, soft, mocking, like it was coming from the corner of my room. My heart raced as I forced myself to look. There was nothing there, just shadows cast by the lamp, playing tricks on my eyes. But the laughter didn't stop. It grew louder, sharper, until it felt like it was echoing inside my head. I pressed my hands to my ears, willing it to stop, but it only grew louder, drowning out everything else. And then, just as suddenly as it had started, it stopped. Silence fell, heavy and oppressive, leaving me lying there in the dark, trembling. I don't know how long I stayed like that, listening to my own ragged breathing, but eventually, exhaustion took over, and I drifted into a fitful sleep. When I woke up, the laughter was gone, but the feeling remained. This sense that something was waiting for me, watching from just out of sight, biding its time. I wanted to tell someone, to confide in a friend, but how could I? It sounded insane. Hey, I participated in some weird dark web experiment, and now I'm hearing voices. Yeah, real believable. But that's not even the worst part. I thought I was alone in this, that whatever I'd unleashed was targeting only me. But then, I started hearing things about the other participants, people who'd signed up for that same study, who'd been exposed to those same frequencies. And some of them, well, they hadn't been heard from since. I didn't know how to track down the others, but the thought gnawed at me, keeping me up at night. What had happened to them? Were they experiencing the same things? Or worse? I wasn't sleeping much by then. Every little sound kept me on edge, and that eerie feeling, that creeping sensation of being watched, was always there, lurking just below the surface. I tried distracting myself, burying myself in mindless tasks, but it was no use. No matter where I went, that feeling followed me, like a shadow I couldn't shake. Then, one night, I got a message. It was in my email, the same one I'd used to sign up for the study. The subject line read, "Follow-up assessment, urgent." The name on the email was unfamiliar, and there was no sender address. Just a single line of text in the body. "You may be experiencing side effects. We need to speak." Attached was a phone number with no area code, just an odd string of numbers that didn't look like any I'd seen before. Against my better judgment, I called it. The line clicked, but no one spoke. I waited, listening to a low hum on the other end, my heart pounding. Finally, a voice came through, calm, detached, almost robotic. "You participated in a sensory enhancement study," it stated. "You may be experiencing unusual perceptions. These are common side effects." "Who is this?" I demanded, gripping the phone so tightly my knuckles turned white. "That information is irrelevant," the voice replied, smooth and indifferent. "We have initiated a second phase to manage your perceptual responses. You are expected to comply." "Manage my... What are you talking about?" I was trying to stay calm, but panic crept into my voice. "I didn't sign up for this. Whatever's happening, just make it stop." The voice on the other end paused, and I could have sworn I heard faint whispers in the background, like a distant conversation just out of earshot. "Compliance ensures stability. Resistance may result in complications." Complications. I felt a chill run down my spine. "What do you mean by complications?" But the line went dead, leaving me clutching the phone in stunned silence. For a few days after that call, things seemed to go quiet. The strange sounds faded, the feeling of being watched lessened, and I actually managed to get some sleep. I thought maybe the worst was over, that whatever this second phase was, it had done the trick. But then, things got stranger. It started with the voices. Not whispers anymore, but actual voices, speaking in low, urgent tones. At first, I thought they were coming from my neighbors. I'd hear them late at night, just faint enough to be indistinct, like muffled conversations bleeding through the walls. But every time I tried to make out the words, they would stop, leaving only silence behind. One night, I was lying in bed when I heard it again. A man's voice, low and rough, speaking in clipped, hurried sentences. I strained to hear, pressing my ear to the wall, and that's when I heard a second voice, a woman's, soft and pleading. I couldn't make out everything, but a single word cut through the haze, clear and unmistakable. Leave. My heart pounded as I froze, listening. It was like they were right there, in the room with me. The woman's voice grew desperate, her tone rising with every word. I couldn't catch it all, but fragments stood out. It's not safe. Get out, before it's too late. And then, just as suddenly as they'd begun, the voices fell silent, leaving a ringing in my ears. I lay there paralyzed, waiting for the sounds to start up again. But nothing happened. The next morning, I tried to convince myself it was all just my imagination, that maybe I'd fallen asleep and dreamed it. But deep down, I knew that wasn't true. The voices were too real, too vivid to dismiss as a dream. And worse, they were starting to sound familiar. The more I listened, the more I realized they weren't just random voices. They were people I knew, friends, family, co-workers. Voices I hadn't heard in years, all speaking to me from somewhere just out of reach. And they all had the same message, repeating it over and over in different ways, like a warning echoing through my mind. Leave now. The walls between my apartment and the rest of the world felt thinner every day, like some invisible barrier was crumbling around me. I'd be cooking dinner, and I'd hear my mother's voice calling my name from the hallway. Or I'd be brushing my teeth and hear a friend from high school laughing in the next room. The voices were everywhere, seeping into my thoughts, filling every quiet moment with their desperate pleas. It was maddening. One night, as I sat in my living room, the voices grew louder, a cacophony of warnings blending together until they were almost unbearable. I tried covering my ears, but it was no use. The voices weren't coming from outside. They were in my head, echoing from every corner of my mind. And then, all at once, they stopped. I sat there in the silence, my heart racing, waiting for something to happen. But the silence stretched on, heavy and oppressive, pressing down on me like a weight. I was about to get up, maybe grab a glass of water, when I saw it. A shadow lurking in the corner of my room, just out of reach of the light. It was faint, almost indistinct, but there was something wrong about it. The shape was twisted, unnatural, like it was bending in ways that defied logic. I blinked, hoping it was a trick of the light, but it didn't disappear. It just stood there, motionless, watching me, with an intensity that made my skin crawl. And then it moved. Slowly, it began to creep toward me, its shape shifting and warping with every step. I wanted to scream, to run, but I was frozen, trapped by its gaze. As it came closer, I could feel this overwhelming sense of dread, like I was staring into the void itself. The shadow stopped just a few feet from me, and for a moment, I thought it was over. But then, it leaned in, and I could swear I heard a whisper, soft and chilling, like ice against my skin. You opened the door. I don't remember much after that. When I came to, I was lying on the floor, drenched in sweat, with no memory of how I'd gotten there. The shadow was gone, but its presence lingered, a cold, empty feeling that clung to every inch of my apartment. And now, the voices are back, louder, clearer, more insistent than ever. warning me of things I can't understand, things just beyond my reach. And I can't shake the feeling that whatever I heard in that whisper, whatever I let in, it's not going to leave me alone. I've started to consider my options. Maybe there's a way out of this. Maybe I can find someone who knows what's going on. Or maybe I should do what the voices keep telling me. Maybe it's time to leave. I didn't just want to leave. I needed to. The warnings from the voices grew more urgent, almost frantic, every time I tried to sleep or find a moment of peace. And the shadow, I couldn't get it out of my mind. I knew, somehow, that it wasn't just an illusion or a figment of my imagination. It was real, and it was getting closer. I packed up a bag with essentials, not caring where I'd go or how long I'd be gone. I just wanted to get away from the walls, away from the echoes and shadows that seemed to be closing in on me. But as I moved around my apartment, I felt something shifting in the air. The lights flickered, the familiar sounds of my home, the hum of the fridge, the ticking of the clock, began to distort, as if reality itself was bending around me. I tried to ignore it, grabbing my bag and heading for the door. But the second my hand touched the knob, a surge of static crackled through the air, filling my head with a piercing, metallic noise that forced me to stumble back. And then, in the silence that followed, I heard it. A low, guttural whisper directly behind me. Leaving won't change anything. I whipped around, my heart pounding, but there was nothing there, just the empty, dimly lit space. My skin prickled with the sensation of eyes watching me, unseen, but there, lurking just beyond the edges of light. I backed up slowly, my gaze darting to every shadow, every darkened corner. When I finally made it to the door again, I took a deep breath, clenching the doorknob and forcing myself to twist it. As soon as the door opened, the voices surged back to life, louder and more desperate than ever, almost shouting over one another. Don't go. You're not alone. It will follow. But I didn't care anymore. Whatever was on the other side of that door had to be better than staying here. I bolted, slamming the door behind me, my footsteps echoing down the hallway as I fled. I drove aimlessly for hours, gripping the wheel so hard my knuckles turned white. I wasn't even sure where I was going, just as far as I could from that place. Eventually, I pulled into a random motel off the highway, the kind of place that looked like it hadn't seen a new coat of paint in decades. But at least it was quiet. The man at the front desk gave me a strange look as I checked in, probably wondering why someone looked so disheveled this late at night, but I didn't care. I just wanted a bed, a door I could lock, and maybe, finally, some sleep. The room was as plain as I expected. Dingy carpet, a creaky bed, a small, flickering TV, but it felt safe. I locked the door, bolted it, and then wedged a chair under the handle just to be sure. For the first time in days, I allowed myself to relax, to let the tension in my shoulders ease just a bit. But as I lay there staring at the ceiling, I felt it again, that prickling sensation at the back of my neck, like cold fingers trailing along my spine. The shadows in the room seemed to stretch, creeping toward me as the minutes ticked by. And then, the whispering began again. But this time it was different. The voices were clearer, sharper, and more menacing. They didn't sound like random whispers or faint echoes. They sounded intentional, directed at me, with a cold, calculated malice that made my stomach churn. You can't run from us, they said, their tones dripping with a dark, twisted satisfaction. You let us in. I covered my ears, trying to block them out, but the voices only grew louder, filling the room with their chilling, taunting chorus. My pulse raced as the shadows pooled in the corners, twisting and writhing like they were alive. And then I saw it. The same shadow from my apartment, the twisted, contorted figure, barely more than a silhouette, but unmistakable. It loomed in the corner of the room, watching me with an intensity that made my skin crawl. I could feel its gaze piercing through me, cold and relentless. "You shouldn't have looked," it whispered, its voice slithering into my mind like oil. I stumbled back, nearly tripping over the bed as I tried to get away from it. But no matter where I moved, the shadow seemed to follow, its shape distorting and shifting, almost as if it were mocking me. My mind raced, replaying every decision that had led me to this point, every wrong turn, every warning I'd ignored. Desperation took over. I lunged for the door, yanking it open and stumbling out into the hallway. The cold night air hit me like a slap, but I didn't stop. I ran down the empty corridor, my footsteps echoing in the silence. I could feel it behind me, the shadow trailing just out of sight, creeping closer with every step. I made it to the motel's lobby, where the night clerk looked up in alarm as I burst through the door, breathing heavily, glancing over my shoulder. "What's wrong?" he asked, eyes widening as he took in my panicked expression. I couldn't find the words. I wanted to explain, to tell him what I'd seen, but I knew how insane it would sound. So instead, I just stood there, shaking, listening to the pounding of my own heart, waiting for the shadow to follow me into the light. But it didn't. The shadow remained just beyond the lobby doors, lurking in the darkness outside, as if bound by some invisible barrier. I could see it there, barely a wisp, but watching me, waiting for the moment I'd step back into the night. The clerk gave me a nervous smile, probably thinking I was just another paranoid traveler, and handed me a cup of coffee. "Rough night, huh?" I nodded, gripping the cup like it was my lifeline, forcing myself to take a few shaky sips. The warmth of the coffee grounded me, bringing a small sliver of comfort, but it did nothing to dispel the cold dread pooling in my stomach. As I sat there, I couldn't shake the feeling that I'd crossed a line, that whatever I'd unleashed was far beyond my control, and that the shadow wasn't just some hallucination or lingering paranoia. It was real, and it was coming for me. The voices were right. Running wouldn't change anything. I stayed in the motel lobby until sunrise, watching the darkness just beyond the doors where the shadow lingered. The clerk must have thought I was insane, but he didn't say anything, just gave me a few more cups of coffee and avoided eye contact. I waited for the first light to pierce through the motel's glass doors, and only then did I let out a breath. Somehow, I'd convinced myself that daylight would mean safety. By morning, the shadow was gone, dissolved into thin air, as if it had never been there at all. Part of me wanted to believe it was over, that maybe it was all just some bizarre, lucid nightmare. But deep down, I knew the truth. It wasn't over. It was just beginning. After I left the motel, I drove without direction, just needing to keep moving, needing to put distance between myself and whatever had latched onto me. But no matter where I went, the feeling followed. That prickle of unease, the sense that I wasn't alone, even in broad daylight. It was always there, lurking at the edge of my vision, just waiting for the shadows to lengthen. By evening, I ended up at an old friend's place on the outskirts of town. Jamie was one of those people who didn't ask too many questions, and I was counting on that. I knocked, and when he answered, all he did was give me a look, somewhere between concern and pity, and let me in. I think he could see the fear in my eyes. "Bad trip or something?" he asked as he led me into his dimly lit living room. I didn't answer, just nodded. It was easier to let him believe that I was recovering from some wild night than to explain what I'd actually been through. I didn't want him to know the truth, Didn't want to drag him into whatever nightmare I'd stumbled into. So we sat there, watching reruns on his old TV, letting the noise fill the silence. But as night crept in, the atmosphere shifted. The shadows in the corners seemed darker, thicker, like ink slowly spreading over the walls. Jamie must have noticed too, because he kept glancing over his shoulder, frowning. "Hey, do you feel that?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. I didn't answer. I knew exactly what he was feeling. The same oppressive weight, the same suffocating dread that had been haunting me for days. But now, it was even worse. Like the air itself was pressing down on us, squeezing the room tighter and tighter. And then, the whispers started again. This time, they were louder, more insistent, filling every corner of the room with a low, relentless hum. Jamie's eyes widened as he looked at me, his face pale. What is that?" He heard them too. Before I could respond, the lights flickered, casting long, twisted shadows across the walls. One of the shadows seemed to stretch further, darker and more distinct than the rest, and I knew. It was here. I grabbed Jamie's arm, pulling him toward the door. "We need to go," I whispered, my voice shaking. "Now." But he didn't move, just stared at the shadow as it inched closer, creeping along the walls with an unnatural, jerky movement. His face went slack, his eyes widening in horror, and he whispered, It's looking at me." I tugged his arm again, harder this time, and he finally snapped out of it, stumbling after me as we made our way to the door. But just as we reached it, the lights went out completely, plunging us into pitch-black darkness. In the silence, I could hear it, the faint, mocking laughter, the same laughter I'd heard on that first recording. It echoed through the room, bouncing off the walls, surrounding us. I could feel Jamie's hand trembling in mine as we fumbled for the door, but the laughter grew louder, more distorted, filling the room with a bone-chilling intensity. Then came the voice, that same raspy whisper that had haunted me from the beginning. "You can't escape. You invited me." The door wouldn't budge. It was like something was holding it shut, trapping us inside. I could feel Jamie panicking, pulling on the handle, pounding on the wood, but it was useless. The shadow was closing in, its form shifting, stretching, filling the room with a cold, suffocating darkness. In a last, desperate attempt, I grabbed Jamie and pulled him toward the window. "Help me break it," I shouted, my voice barely audible over the whispering and laughter. Together, we slammed our fists against the glass, again and again, until finally it shattered, spilling shards onto the floor. We climbed through, cutting our hands on the broken glass, stumbling into the cold night air. I could still hear the laughter, faint but unmistakable, as we bolted down the street, not stopping, not looking back. Eventually, we collapsed in an empty lot, gasping for breath, our hands bleeding and our minds reeling. Jamie looked at me, his eyes filled with fear and confusion. "What the hell was that?" he whispered. I didn't have an answer. All I knew was that whatever had come for me, it was getting stronger. And it wasn't just after me anymore. It was spreading, reaching out to anyone who got too close. I haven't slept since that night. Jamie won't answer my calls, and honestly, I don't blame him. I'm on my own now, drifting from place to place, trying to stay one step ahead of the darkness. But no matter where I go, I can still feel it, lurking just behind me, waiting for me to stop. And every night, as I lie awake in whatever temporary shelter I've found, I hear the voices whispering, faint and relentless, seeping into my mind. They're louder now, clearer than ever, repeating the same words over and over. like a mantra I can't escape. You open the door, you let it in, and now it's never going to leave. The shadows are getting closer, and I know deep down that my time is running out. Whatever I unleashed that day, it's coming for me. And this time, I don't think there's anywhere left to run.